Right, first up, our speaker is Jane Hardy. So she teaches locally at the University of Arts, so not much of a commute for her today. She's also a national executive member of the Lecturers UCU Union and the editor of Another Education is Possible magazine. So please give it up for Jane Hardy.
I was quite astounded today to hear George Osborne at the Conservative Party conference talking about us all being in it together. Well, George, tell that to the working class families and people who are carrying the burden of austerity, whereas you and your millionaire colleagues in the cabinet have been protecting their class and their privilege. George Osborne is outraged at the idea that people with properties of 2 million should actually have to pay some extra tax because they've worked very hard for it. Well, that's funny, isn't it? Because there's a contradiction that if you want to get the rich to work harder, you have to pay them more and let them keep more of their money. Whereas if you want to get working class people to work harder, you have to cut their wages and you have to cut their benefits. So one law for one group of people and one law for the others. The cuts and the absolutely vicious welfare proposals, which are due to be implemented next April, actually hit those that are the most vulnerable and the poorest sections of society. Food banks, I know there's one in Luton, but food banks are opening at a rate of 3 a week. I mean, that's a scandal, isn't it, in a country which is one of the richest in the world, where people out of work and people in work do not have enough money to feed their families. And also a government report found that people who'd had their disability living allowances taken away were and who were found fit to work. 50% of them ended up destitute, and some have actually committed suicide. And yet the bankers, who are the cause of the crisis and who have systematically fleeced us by mis-selling insurance, by manipulating interest rates, and even by laundering the money of organised crime. Well, I don't see any bankers in prison or any bankers having to pay the costs of austerity. Now, austerity, or so-called austerity, is not just simply about the cuts that they're making. It's about a massive distribution of resources away from the public and into the pockets of the rich and big companies. The government have not dared to say that they're going to privatise the National Health Service, but that is what they are actually doing. Bit by bit, they're parcelling it up and they're selling it off to big companies like Virgin. Well, Virgin can't even run a rail service properly, so I certainly don't want them to be running parts of the National Health Service. In education, so-called free schools and academies and universities are also being taken over by big business. And here in Luton there's a very classic example of that. Barnfield College, which I'll talk about in a minute, who were on strike last week, is destined, if the CEO of the college has his way, to become the first private college of further education. What that meant for the lecturers was that they had to sign new contracts where they were asked to work actually unlimited hours, not 15, not 20, not 25 hours, but any hours that they were asked to do. And that was in anticipation of privatising the college. And that picket line was really fantastic. I don't know if there's anyone from Barnfield here tonight. There were 50 or 60 very, very angry women and young lecturers out, and it was the first time that they'd been on strike. And that's the sort of action that we need to roll back the sort of attacks that we're facing. So the demonstration on the 20th of October is about cuts, but it's also about saying that we want to keep health and education and the railways, we want to keep those things public. When we march on October the 20th, we'll be marching alongside and in conjunction with workers in other European countries who faced even more vicious cuts than we have in the UK. And if you look at last week, there were mass protests in Spain, in Greece, in Portugal and in France, and we'll be adding our voice to those. And in each of those countries, working class people are facing the same thing. Attacks on their wages, on their pensions, and on their public services. And, you know, there's a whole generation, a whole lost generation of young people who have never had a job. In the UK, there's a scandalous 1 million young people who are out of work. And in Spain, that figure is 50%. 1 in 2 young people who haven't got any sort of employment. An absolute scandal. We're told that there is no alternative, and that's absolutely ridiculous. There is an alternative, and I could talk a long time talking about what that is, but let's just take a few things. First of all, let's have, instead of cuts to housing, let's have a mass programme of building affordable housing. That's the first thing. Let's have an increase in taxation on higher incomes and corporations. I was just reading in the Financial Times before I came out that suddenly London is very attractive for multinational corporations because it is so cheap. Let's not make it cheap. Let's tax those companies and let's put the money back into public services. And let's invest in training and education for young people. Let's have a massive injection of money into further education and reverse the £9,000 that students are now having to pay if they want to come to university. So just to finish, because I know there's lots of other speakers, on the 20th of October we need to get as many people on the coaches that are going from Luton, the one that we've got from Hatfield and Welwyn into London, to say no to austerity. But also, I just want to put this idea into people's heads. We need to look beyond the 20th of October as well. Last November, a large number of us were out on strike in defence of our pensions. And that was a fantastic response up and down the country. It was true in Luton, it was true in Hertford, where I went, and nearly every single town. The biggest local demonstrations I have seen for decades of people protesting against the attack on their living standards. You know, what we need to do, but unfortunately that wasn't built into anything, and we want to make sure that doesn't happen this time. The TUC passed a motion to look into the possibility of a general strike. And what I'd like to say is let's turn that possibility into a reality. Let's march on the 20th of October, but then let's start looking for a day when every factory, every office, every school and every university closes down and we say no to austerity and this vicious government.
Thank you very much.